Well, tonight we're looking at Acts chapter 21, and we're going to finish the chapter looking at verses 27 through 40. Quick review. Paul has finally made it to Jerusalem, and for several chapters that was his goal, to finally make it to the city of Jerusalem. He wanted to be there for the Pentecost celebration, and he was able to do so. So the third missionary journey is completed. It's behind him. We begin a brand new section, which we're calling Paul's Witness before Jews, Gentiles, and Kings. And this will take us from chapter 21, verse 17, to the end of chapter 26. And when we talk about Jews, Gentiles, and Kings, this was something that God told Ananias that Paul was going to do. And that's in Acts chapter 9, verse 15. But the Lord said to Ananias, "Go, this man," meaning Paul, "is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and the people of Israel." So in this section, there's three major speeches. The first one's given to the Jewish people, and that's in chapter 22, and we'll look at that one soon. The next speech is in chapter 24, and Paul's going to give a defense speech before the Roman governor Felix. And then finally, in chapter 26, Paul's going to give a speech before King Agrippa II. So this promise is going to be fulfilled. Paul is going to stand before Gentiles, Jewish people, and kings. And he's going to proclaim the message that Jesus is the Messiah. So we begin with Paul's witness before the Jews. And this is in Acts chapter 21, verse 17, all the way to chapter 23, verse 35. And the amazing thing about this is this covers 3 chapters, but it only covers 12 days in the life of Paul. Luke is right there with him, and he almost gives us a play-by-play of everything Paul does for those 12 days. Last week we looked at the concern of the Jerusalem church. Paul arrives in Jerusalem. He meets the elders of the church, led by James, the brother of our Lord. And Paul explains that he's been in Gentile territory proclaiming the message of Jesus. And yes, some Jewish people have come to faith, but mostly Gentile people have come to faith. And all the leaders of the church praised God for what he was doing. But then they gave Paul a warning, a word of caution, that some of the Jewish people have some hesitations about his message. Many feel that Paul is turning Jewish people away from Judaism, and that even Paul himself is turning away from his Jewish faith. And yes, Paul is doing some things that Jewish people normally would not do. He is associating with Gentiles. He's eating with Gentiles. He's staying in the home of Gentiles. But Paul is also very Jewish. He keeps the Passover celebration. He wants to be in Jerusalem for Pentecost. And so the elders of the church have this plan for Paul to prove his Jewishness. And the plan is for Paul to participate in a purification ceremony. If you were a Jewish person and you traveled into Gentile territory, when you came back to the land of Israel, you had to go through a purification ceremony to purify yourself from the Gentiles that you were associating with. And that ceremony lasted for 7 days. Paul was also supposed to pay the price for 4 Jewish Christians to complete their Nazirite vow. And Paul said, "I'll do it to prove my Jewishness to the people in Jerusalem." And that's where we left off. Tonight, we're going to talk about the riot in the temple area. That's a good title for a lesson, isn't it? So let me read these verses from Acts chapter 21, verses 27 through 36, and then we'll talk about them one by one. So Acts chapter 21, beginning with verse 27. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who teaches all people everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple area and defiled this holy place. They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested Paul and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great, he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed him kept shouting, "Away with him!" As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." Having received the commander's permission, Paul stood up on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. So that's a look at the riot in the temple. So let's break it down in detail. When it talks about the 7 days that were nearly over, that's the 7 days of purification. So Paul shows up in the temple to begin the 7 days. Then he must return to the temple 7 days later to complete the ceremony of purification. But while he's there, some Jewish people spot him. And it's interesting, we're not talking about Jewish people who live in Jerusalem. We're talking about Jewish people from the province of Asia. That was the city of Ephesus. And Paul had spent 3 years in Ephesus. He had spent 3 months in their synagogue trying to reason with the Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. Many believed, but those who did not threw him out of the synagogue and got very angry with him. And many of them wanted to kill him. In fact, as Paul is about to leave Ephesus, he gives hints of the fact that the Jews are very angry with him. So the Jews who do not want to believe that Jesus is the Messiah are angry with Paul, and many of them would really love to kill him. And so some of these Jewish people from Asia, they're in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost, just like Paul is. They spot him. They stir up the whole crowd and they seize him. They make a citizen's arrest as they grab Paul. And then the question is, well, what did he do to cause all of this? So they shout, "Men of Israel, help us. This is the man who teaches all people everywhere against our people, our law, and this place. He has bad things to say about the people of Israel, about the law, the Torah, and also about the temple." Those are the charges against Paul. Those are 3 fundamental beliefs that the Jewish people have. 3 things that you don't mess with. Who they are as a people, the law of Moses, and the Jewish temple. 3 very sacred things to the Jewish people. And it's interesting that they accused Stephen back in chapter 6 of speaking against the law and the temple. So it's the Torah and the temple. But this time, Paul is accused of speaking against the people, the Jewish people as well. Why would they say that? Well, Paul is proclaiming a message that God is calling forth a brand new people. People who believe in Jesus as their Messiah. And these people that God is calling forth are both Jewish people and Gentile people. It's people that we would call the church today. That the new people of God are people who believe in Jesus as Messiah. And the Jewish people were thinking, wait a second, we're the chosen people of God because we have the law of Moses, because we have all of these traditions. And Paul, are you now telling us that we're not acceptable to God because we don't believe in Jesus as Messiah? And so there's a lot of tension because of that. You have Jewish people who don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And you have Gentile people who do believe that Jesus is the Messiah. I'm not saying by that the church has replaced Israel, but I'm saying what Paul writes about in Romans chapters 9 through 11, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. That right now in the church, Jewish people seem to be blind to the truth of Jesus as their Messiah. And in Israel today, that's true. We've had many Jewish people since 1948 return to the land of Israel. So physically, they're back in the land. But spiritually, they haven't turned to God. I mean, they haven't even returned to the Jewishness of their faith, yet alone faith in Jesus as Messiah. But when Jesus returns, that's when the Jewish people will recognize him. They will recognize the one that their ancestors had put to death many years prior. And they will mourn over the one they have pierced, the Bible says. So the church doesn't replace Israel, but right now there's a time when God is calling all people to believe in Jesus as Messiah. And one day that message will reach Israel once again. So, in a sense, Paul is saying, just because you're Jewish doesn't mean you're right with God. In fact, if you'll read the Gospels, Jesus said the same thing. At one point, Jesus says, don't tell me that you're a son of Abraham, because God's able to take those stones over there and raise up sons of Abraham if he wants to. The issue is not who you are. The issue is, where's your faith? And for the Jewish people, it wasn't in Jesus as their Messiah. So they also accuse him of defiling the holy place, which is really ironic. Why is Paul in the temple? To perform a purification ceremony. Why is he doing that? So that he doesn't defile the temple. He's been outside the land of Israel. He's back. He's purifying himself so he doesn't defile anything. And what do they accuse him of? Defiling the holy place. Now, the Jewish people also charge him with bringing Greeks into the temple area. And I want to show you this picture. It's not the best picture, but it's perfect to show you what I want to show you. This area right here, this rectangle, is the temple proper. Outside the temple proper is something called the court of the Gentiles. In the court of the Gentiles, anybody and everybody was welcome to go there. If you were a Gentile, it's okay if you go to the court of the Gentiles. But if you're a Gentile, you cannot enter into the temple proper. And the first place you would enter into the temple would be the court of women. And in the court of women, well, that's where Jewish women were allowed to go. In many ways, this picture is a great picture of society, Jewish society, in the first century. Where are the Gentiles? Outsiders, not allowed in. Where are the women in Jewish society? Well, they can go so far, but then that's cut off as well. You have the court of Israel. That's where the Jewish men could go hang out. They could go a little further in. Then you had the court of priests, and only the priests were allowed in that area. So if you were not a priest, you could not go into that area. And then finally you have the holy place, or the most holy place, where only the high priest could go one time a year. See how segregated and exclusive the Jewish society was? And that's part of the point of this whole thing. There's a 4.5-foot wall around the court of the women that has signs basically telling non-Jewish people, you can go no further than right here. You know, this is as far as you can go. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, actually it's Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14, Paul talks about a dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles. And Paul isn't just speaking metaphorically. He's speaking literally. Now, even today, metaphorically, we talk about there being a wall between people. If two people are not getting along, if they're not communicating, we'll often say there's a wall between those people. Well, there really was a wall between Gentile people and Jewish people. It was a 4.5-foot wall in the Jewish temple. And what does Paul say about that wall? Well, metaphorically at least, Jesus broke it down with his cross. Because of the cross, there's no longer a wall between Jewish people and Gentile people. But in the temple, well, it still existed at this time. So, Josephus points out that there are warning stones all along that wall. Some of those stones are written in Greek, some in Latin. And here's what the inscription reads. No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and enclosure. Anyone who is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his ensuing death. I think they're taking that seriously. So basically what they were saying, no Gentiles beyond this point. And by the way, if you're going to be so brazen or brave to actually try to enter this area, we're going to kill you. And there's a speech that's attributed to the Roman general Titus, who later became the emperor, basically giving the Jewish people the right to execute anyone who entered into their temple unlawfully. So even if you were a Roman citizen, the Jewish people, if you entered into their temple area unlawfully, they could kill you, and the Roman government would say it was okay. So, by saying that Paul took Gentiles into the Jewish temple unlawfully, what are they saying? We have the right to execute Paul for what he did. And the Roman government's not going to say anything about it, because they've given us the right to execute anyone who's non-Jewish who enters into our temple. So normally the Jewish people would not have the right to perform capital punishment. But in this case, they do have the right. Now, according to all the literature from the time, nobody ever tries to do that. There's no evidence of the Jewish people ever executing anyone because they did it, because apparently nobody tried to do it. So, is Paul guilty or is Paul innocent? Well, Luke makes it quite clear in verse 29 that Paul is very innocent. They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple area. Well, they knew that Trophimus was with Paul, And when it says they assumed that they brought him into the temple area, it could just be that they made up the story that Paul had brought him into the temple area. Because if you want to get rid of somebody, you need to accuse them of a capital crime. And this is a capital crime. And it's also a capital crime where you have the power to carry out the execution, and the Romans aren't going to say anything. So did Paul actually do this? Paul was in the temple to purify himself, to prove to the Jewish people how Jewish he was. Obviously, Paul did not violate that particular law. He did not bring Trophimus into the temple area. And as we're about to find out, when they finally grab a hold of Paul, Trophimus is nowhere to be found because he's not there. And did Trophimus accidentally wander into that area? Well, as one commentator put it, that's about as likely as somebody taking a sightseeing tour of the Kremlin and accidentally walking into some forbidden areas. It's just not going to happen. So Paul is absolutely innocent of what they are accusing him of doing. Verse 30 says, the whole city was aroused. That may appear to be an exaggeration, but the temple area in Jerusalem was town square. And if town square was aroused, well, the whole city is aroused. Everybody's upset, everybody's in panic, and people come running from all different directions, and seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. The Jewish people had an unwritten law. If you want to kill somebody or execute somebody, don't do it in the temple area, because their blood will defile the temple area. So they can't kill Paul while he's in the temple area. So what do? They drag him out of the temple area, and they drag him into the court of the Gentiles, outside the temple. You have to give them credit. They are following their traditions all the way to the end. So they drag Paul out of the temple, because as long as he's in the court of the Gentiles, they can execute him, they can spill his blood, and it won't defile anything. Then it says the gates were shut. As soon as they got Paul out of the temple area, they shut the gates. And they shut the gates to keep Paul from running back in, because if he runs back in, they can't do anything to him in the temple area, so they'd have to drag him back out again. So he can't run back in, and also it just kind of calms things down a little bit. And if the Romans happen to come running in, it keeps them out of the temple area as well. This last phrase, the gates were shut, many see as very symbolic of what's going on with the Jewish people. This is the last time the Jewish temple will be mentioned in the book of Acts. So the last act in the Jewish temple is to shut the gates. God's messenger is the Apostle Paul. They shut him out of the temple. God's message is that Jesus is the Messiah, and that's what Paul is proclaiming. And they don't want to hear that either. So they've shut out God's message and God's messenger from the temple. They are saying no more. And in many ways, this final rejection of Jesus as Messiah opens the door for Jesus' prophecy to be fulfilled. And what was Jesus' prophecy about Jerusalem? That the city would be completely destroyed, and one stone would not be left upon another. This is AD 57 when this takes place. The temple gets destroyed 13 years later in AD 70. The prophecy is fulfilled. And here are the Jewish people. If they would just listen to Paul, and turn to Jesus. Could have been a different story. But they shut the door. They said no for the last time. It's a sad verse about what happened to the Jewish people. And it's a sad thing in the life of people today when they shut the door on God too and say, I'm not interested. Don't want to hear it. I'm done. And the door gets shut because they close it. So, in many ways, this is very symbolic of what's going to happen to the Jewish people. So in verse 31, and I love the way Luke writes it, he doesn't mince words, while they were trying to kill him. So while the Jewish people are trying to kill Paul, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. And you may be thinking, they're trying to kill Paul outside the temple. How long is it going to take for the commander to find out about this? Well, actually, not that long. You can see at the upper left-hand corner, which happens to be the northwest corner of the temple, you have the castle or the fortress of Antonia. That is a Roman soldier's fortress. Herod the Great had that built. And there's a good possibility that that's home to as many as 1,000 Roman soldiers. And the commander, the Roman commander over the city of Jerusalem, that's his headquarters. At this Tower of Antonia, there's a tower that goes up about 100 feet. And there was always a Roman soldier on top, overlooking the entire temple. And it was his job, if there was a riot breaking out, of a disturbance, he could immediately get word to the commander. And immediately soldiers could be dispatched into the Jewish area. The steps of this fortress led right down into the court of the Gentiles. So it was many ways, it was like they built a police station right next to the temple, where if anything went wrong, they could be on the scene within a matter of seconds. And Herod the Great understood that any disturbance that takes place in Jerusalem is likely to take place in the temple. So he just built a fort right outside the temple area. So they are able to get there quickly. It talks about the commander. And the commander is a tribune. He's in charge of a cohort, which means he's the leader of 1,000 soldiers. He is a very high official for the Roman government, the Roman military. And we learn later that his name is Claudius Lysias. Claudius Lysias. And because the governor lived in Caesarea and rarely visited Jerusalem, Lysias is in charge of the Roman government in Jerusalem. It's also his responsibility to keep the peace in Jerusalem. So when he hears of a potential riot, which, by the way, the Roman government hated riots. I mean, if you want to get the Romans riled up, a riot would do that more than anything. So he's able to respond very quickly. So Paul is being beat up. They're trying to kill him. Word gets to the commander that there's an uproar in Jerusalem. And this is another picture of the fortress. And again, it's right there on the northwest corner of the temple. The middle is the temple proper. Outside is the court of the Gentiles. They could be there in a matter of seconds. And so whoever the soldier was on top of the tower sends word that Jerusalem is turning into a riot. We need to respond immediately. He at once, the commander, took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. The word officers is a centurion, meaning a commander of 100 troops. And since it's plural, most scholars think that he took at least 200 troops with him. So here comes the commander and 200 Roman soldiers rushing to the scene. And if you're a Jewish person and you see the commander coming and 200 armed Roman soldiers coming, you run. You don't want to get caught up in that. And that's exactly what they do. They run away and they stop beating Paul. So, because of the Roman intervention, Paul's life is spared. The commander comes up to Paul and he arrests him. It's obvious that he's the troublemaker. He's the one that, they're after. What did he do? So he immediately arrests him, and he's arrested and bound with 2 chains. And it could be that he's handcuffed on each of his arms and then chained physically to a Roman soldier. Back then, to keep you from escaping, they would chain you to a Roman soldier. In this case, 2. You got one on your right and one on your left. Where are you going to go? There's nowhere for you to go. It could also be that the 2 chains mean they chained his hands together, and it could also mean that they chained his feet together as well. Remember the prophecy of Agabus just a few chapters before, where he took Paul's belt and he wrapped it around his own hands and his own feet and said to Paul, that's what's going to happen to you if you go to Jerusalem. So it could be that they bound his hands and they bound his feet. Now, Lysias did not show up to rescue Paul. That wasn't his reason. He wanted to stop the riot. Lysias knows that his superiors don't like riots, and it's his responsibility to keep peace and to keep things under control. But as it turns out, if Lysias didn't act so quickly, the book of Acts would end in this chapter because Paul would be dead. And Luke would say, they killed Paul, and that's the end of the story. From this moment on to the end of the book, you would almost come to the conclusion that Paul is like a cat. He has 9 lives. This is the first time his life is spared. It won't be the last. And it's amazing how many times God spares Paul's life between chapter 21 and chapter 28. And I'll try to point those out to you, and we'll try to count them up as we go along. But this is the first time. I mean, if this didn't happen, Paul would have been dead, the book would have been closed. Now, Lysias wants to know the answer to the obvious question. Who is this guy? And what did he do that all of you want to kill him? That's the question. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken to the barracks. We've seen this before. When Demetrius led a crowd, and a lot of the people showed up, and they didn't even know what the issue was. They just know that there was a crowd, and they showed up to find out what was going on. So when it's asked, who is this and what did he do? Well, some say one thing, some say another, but nothing made sense to this military man. So he decides he's going to take Paul to the barracks and try to find out later what's going on. And we're going to find out later that Lysias has some ways of getting at answers once Paul's in the barracks. But we'll talk about that in a few weeks. When Paul reached the steps, and at this point he's at the bottom steps to go up the steps to the barracks. So he's still in the court of the Gentiles, and the steps lead up into this fortress. At the bottom of the steps, the violence is so great that he has to be carried by the soldiers up the steps. Why is that? We're not sure. They just tried to kill Paul. We don't know the extent of his injuries, and Luke never tells us. So he could have been pretty beat up, although he's about to give a speech. So they didn't knock him unconscious. He's got his wits about him. Also, it could be that they bound him hand and foot, which made it just easier to pick him up and carry him up the stairs. So that's what the soldiers decide to do. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." In other words, Romans, judge him and execute him. Get rid of him. Do those words sound familiar? Remember Jesus before the Jewish people? Pilate brings him out. Pilate says, "I've got Barabbas and I've got Jesus. What do you want me to do with Barabbas?" "Release him." And Pilate says, "Well, what do you want me to do with Jesus, the King of the Jews?" And they yelled, "Crucify him. Crucify him. Get rid of him." So again, we see that Paul's story is tracking, very similar to Jesus' story. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, he got arrested. So did Paul. Then there was a trial, although this is not much of a trial. But the Jewish people, what do they want to do with Jesus? Crucify him. What do they want to do with Paul? Get rid of him. Execute him. I mean, we were trying to do that till you interrupted us. So if you don't want us to do it, you do it. You get rid of him. And then we have this section that I already read. It's Paul's request to address the crowd. And that's verses 37 through 40. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, so now they've climbed the steps. So now they're at the top of the steps, about to enter into the barracks. And Paul says to the commander, "May I say something to you?" And then the commander says, "Do you speak Greek?" Really, he said, "Wow, you can speak Greek?" The commander thinks that Paul's just a rebel. He's a revolutionary. He's a hard man, uneducated, just a roughneck, a troublemaker. But here's Paul speaking polite, eloquent, polished Greek. And the commander's going, "Wow, didn't know you could do that." And then in verse 38, the commander says, "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert some time ago?" Well, Josephus also talks about this story. And there was an Egyptian Jewish man who decided to lead an insurrection, a revolt, against the Romans. And according to Luke, he had about 4,000 followers. According to Josephus, he had about 30,000 followers. And he takes them out to the desert. Then he takes them to the Mount of Olives. And then he tells them that the walls of Jerusalem are going to fall flat at my command. And it will give you easy access to run in and destroy, kill all the Romans. Well, obviously, this Egyptian Jew knew the story of Joshua in the Battle of Jericho, when the people of Israel marched around Jericho and eventually shouted and the walls fell in. And apparently he thought the same thing was going to happen to the wall around Jerusalem. But instead of that happening, Felix shows up with a lot of Roman soldiers. And at the end of the day, 400 of his followers are killed, 200 of his followers are captured, and this Egyptian Jew has to run for his life along with everybody else. And Lysias looks at Paul and says, "Aren't you that guy? Aren't you that Egyptian that started a revolution some time ago and escaped and ran away?" And Paul answers and says, nope, I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. So Paul says, no, I'm not a terrorist. No, not an Egyptian either. I'm Jewish. In many ways, Luke is sending a message, in a subtle way, that Christianity is not a revolutionary movement. Paul didn't show up to lead a revolution against Rome. That was not his purpose. He's Jewish, and he's from the city of Tarsus, which was a highly educated city. So in other words, Paul is saying, I'm a highly educated man. I'm not a revolutionary. I'm not somebody who, spent most of my life not studying, just simply getting by, and now I just simply want to lead a terrorist group. No, I'm a highly educated person. Now, later on, Paul's going to talk about his Roman citizenship. He doesn't talk about that here, just the fact that he's a citizen of the city of Tarsus. So Paul says to Lysias, let me speak to the people. And then the question is he really going to let Paul address this mob? Will Paul even be able to address this mob? Lysias wants to know who Paul is and what he did. He's obviously figured out that Paul's pretty educated. He's a smart man. He's not just a revolutionary. So is he going to let him speak or not? Well, having received the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps, meaning the steps that lead into the barracks, looking out over the court of Gentiles, and he motions to the crowd. Now, part of rhetoric, before you begin a speech, you were to motion to the crowd. I have no idea what that motion looks like. But it was part of rhetoric that you would somehow motion to the crowd, whatever signal you gave them. It was a signal for them to be quiet and give you their attention. And what's amazing is that when Paul motions to the crowd, they all become silent. And it kind of makes me wonder why. Well, there are 200 Roman soldiers standing around. That might influence the crowd just a little bit. Maybe they really do want to hear what Paul has to say. And Paul decides to address them not in Greek, but in Aramaic, which happens to be their language. So Paul is very intelligent. He speaks Greek. He also speaks Aramaic. And he's going to address them in their own language, trying to connect with them in such a way that he can communicate the message of Jesus with them, and at the same time, prove that he is Jewish, prove that he is innocent of the charges of speaking against the Torah, speaking against the temple, and speaking against the Jewish people. And in Acts chapter 22, that's Paul's speech. And of course, it's going to have to wait until the next time. But if you want to read it in advance, you are free to do that. A fascinating story. Paul was told, if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be arrested. It happened. Paul gets arrested. But now Paul's going to have an opportunity, one more time, to communicate to the Jewish people who Jesus is and why he really is their Messiah. And we'll look at that speech. We never know what situation God's going to put us in. We never know when we'll have an opportunity to share our faith. But we should always be ready to share our faith. I love Paul's willingness to talk. Paul says, look, there's a huge crowd. Let me talk to them. I can tell all of these Jewish people all at once about Jesus. Just let me talk to the people. And that should be our heart as well. Let's share our message of what we know to be true about Christ. Well, let me close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this fascinating story. Father, I thank you how you work in people's lives in such a way that even though circumstances may not be great, there's still an opportunity to serve you. There's still an opportunity to talk about you. Paul has just been beat up, but he has an opportunity to talk about Jesus, and he wants to take advantage of that opportunity. So, Father, even in our lives when things aren't going well, you still have a plan. You still have a purpose, and there's still an opportunity for us to share our faith and to talk about who you are in our lives. So, Father, make us bold in our faith. Give us opportunities to talk about you to those people that we know. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.